Hello everyone, thank you for all of your questions. I really appreciate everybody who's been working hard on their beginners foundational level online courses, and I've had a few questions that I want to go through in this video. So first of all, we're going to look at setting the hook properly and also what types of threads could be used for different types of needles. Okay, so what I've done is I've set up a size 130 needle, and 130 is quite thick, as you can see here. We've also got a size 70, which is very fine, and finally we've got 100. And these are all Schmetz needles. They are available on the website, and usually I just have them set up so I can just use which one I particularly want to for whatever I'm working on. So I've just labelled them individually here. And what I've done here is I've got some embroidery thread, so just normal embroidery floss. And what I've done is I've got 4 strands, so normally it comes in 6 strands, and this one here has 4, and we also have 2 strands here, and I have a single strand. Okay, the fabric that I'm working on is a linen, 100% linen fabric, which is printed with this floral design. So what we're going to do first of all is just show you the setup for the hook. So here if we go with 130, now as you can see the hook is facing upwards in line with the fixing screw. Now some of you have said, I set my hook but then it seems to shift. So I think the video is pretty good to explain that when it's set correctly, remember, sharp piece is facing upwards in line with the fixing screw. Remember that when you're in the fabric you have to have it in line, otherwise when you lift it through you're not going to know which way the hook is facing, so that would mean it would be a bit of a struggle to lift it through. If the hook is shifting, a couple of things you can do. One is you can just tighten this with a set of pliers, and that will help just to really keep it firm. But be aware that when you're a beginner you're actually putting a lot of pressure on the hook, so you're usually quite tense. And what happens when you're doing that is you usually kind of, if you get the odd moment when you're struggling to come through, you kind of end up forcing it a tiny bit. And what happens is eventually that's going to move the hook slightly over time. So what I always say, because I always check my hook as well, is that in between pauses, when you have that pause, just check the hook, make sure it's in alignment before you start doing the next piece of work. Because 9 times out of 10 you'll find it's not you, it's the hook that's just not set up in the right position. So just be aware that when you're holding the hook you want to be light fingered with it, so you're not holding it with too much tension. And remember, when you're lifting through, if you're in that position there, go back down slightly and just move the hook into a better position and then try it again. Okay, the worst thing you can do is be in the wrong position, you're lifting it through and you kind of force it a bit. There's a chance you might be able to get it through, but what will happen is the hook will start to shift slightly. Okay, so that's one thing. What I'm going to do is a little demonstration with the chain stitch. And first of all, you can use, for example, 2 strands for the size 90 or 100. Now, I usually find if I'm using a thicker fabric, I like to use a thicker needle. They don't always say that's the case. They usually say you have to match up the thickness of the thread with the thickness of the needle. But I do find, for example, 100 would be perfect for this linen. You can use a size 90, but because it's got a bit more push, because it's thicker, it kind of pushes the fibres through a bit easier when you're working with it. So it's not a general rule, but you should really match the needle to the thread. But I would say particularly with this type of fabric, for example, it's good to work with the one up rather than the one below. Okay, so I'm just going to do a basic chain stitch here. So you'll find as well when you use thicker threads and thicker fabrics, you really have to push on the back of the hook, so you make it an obvious push to lift it through. And I'm just going to come back down here. Okay, and then just rotate and then lift it back up again. So that's just using 2 strands of embroidery thread. Okay. And that's using the 100 hook. Right, I'm just going to pull that all the way through. We're not going to worry about finishing those. So then let's go on to the size 130, and I'm going to use 4 strands together. Okay, so this is going to look very thick. It's not something I usually work with, but you can use it on thicker fabric. It will look quite effective. You wouldn't really want to use very thick embroidery for fine fabric like silk organza or you know, chiffon or georgettes. It doesn't suit it so well because it's just a little bit too thick for that fabric. Okay, so what we're going to do here, just to give you an idea of the thickness, see how I do my starting knot just a bit wider than normal, and just plunging through. Okay, so again you could use the size 120 or 130, but again my preference is just to go the size up because of the thickness of this fabric. Okay, just going to pull that stitch back and then change direction. But you do see this thread, this type of embroidery on linen, particularly in Mexican designs as well, so it can look really effective. Okay, so there you can see the thickness of that thread coming through. Just going to unlatch that there, and I just quickly want to show you the size 70. Now, as you know, you can use the size 70 for the filagant metallic thread, plus you can use the size 80, but I'm just going to use a single strand, and I'll just run that parallel just so you can see the difference. And actually it's quite nice to add different thicknesses of embroidery together depending on what you're working on, and it can give it a bit more dimension too. And you can see how easily that plunges through, and that's the size 70, just using a single strand of thread. Okay, so I think that was one of Emma's questions. I will be going through other questions over the next 7 days. Just going to unlatch that. Okay, so remember, the smaller the needle, the thinner the thread. If you had to choose between a size 100 to 120, sorry, 130 to 120, take into account the thickness of the fabric as well. So that's just a consideration. Okay, so I hope that helps. I will be running through another question tomorrow, and we will be talking more about drafting a pattern onto a bigger piece of fabric. This is mostly if you've got a larger frame, so I will be discussing a little bit more about that tomorrow. Okay, take care.